Yeah, hello everyone. Hello, Professor Duncan. It's indeed great to have you here, virtually, but still, nonetheless, great to have you here. Professor Rebecca Duncan is a researcher in the Department of Languages and member of the Linnaeus University Center for Concurrences in Colonial and Postcolonial Studies, where she coordinates the research cluster titled Aesthetics of Empire. She holds degrees from the University of Cape Town and Justus Liebig University in Gießen in Germany. She works in postcolonial and world literature with a focus on Southern Africa and with a particular interest in world ecological approaches, the body, and embodiment and speculative forms. She is the author of South African Gothic, published by the University of Wales and the University of Chicago Press in 2018, which was shortlisted for the 2019 Alan Lloyd Smith Memorial Prize. Her work features in a number of edited volumes, including the Routledge Handbook of African Literature, published in 2019, 21st Century Gothic, published by the University Press in 2019, the Routledge Handbook to the Ghost Story, 2017, and Neoliberal Gothic, Manchester University Press, 2017. Today, her talk is titled Gothic Vulnerability, Mapping the Colonial Boomerang from Atlantique to His House. Over to you, Professor Duncan.
Okay, thank you so much, Atul, for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to say thank you very much also to Pramod and Anna for inviting me to give this talk. It's really, it's wonderful to be here, and I'm really looking forward to discussing this material with you after I finished the presentation. So let me see, I'm going to share my screen. This is the moment where we hold our breath. There we go. So it seems to be coming. Good. Okay. Good. So I think that everybody should be able to see the slides now. And I'm just gonna just before I get too carried away, let me just check that they're also moving. They are. Excellent. Okay. Great. Okay, so my talk today is entitled Gothic Vulnerability, Mapping the Colonial Boomerang from Atlantique to His House. And as I will mention in a few moments, it's actually a talk which combines a number of recent publications, and I'll give you some information about those so that if you're really interested, you can go and check them out. Before I get going, I want that the presentation will be dealing with some sensitive content. So I will be discussing topics related to small boat migration, so from parts of Africa to parts of Europe, and the films that I'm dealing with both engage with the loss of lives on this perilous journey. And you will see stills later on in the presentation which represent parts of the crossing. And then also, in the second half of the talk, you can expect to see images of monsters and monstrous figures, which are also connected to migration-related trauma. So a heads up, so that you know what's on the way. Okay, all right. I want to start with a comment from Nancy Fraser's recent book, Cannibal Capitalism, where she diagnoses the planetary present as follows. She says, this is a time that is characterized by crushing debt, precarious work, perceived livelihoods, dwindling services, crumbling infrastructures, and hardened borders, racialized violence, deadly pandemics, and extreme weather, all overarched by political dysfunctions that block our ability to envision, and implement solutions. As the title of Fraser's book suggests, she understands these manifold crises as having a common cause, and the cause is capitalism. But also more specifically, what she thinks of as the cannibalistic function of capitalism. And so she writes the following about that. She says, cannibalism is an apt characterization of the process by which capital draws into its orbit natural and social wealth from peripheral zones of the world system. The Ouroboros, the self-cannibalizing serpent that eats its own tail, that's a fitting image for a system that's wired to devour the social, political, and natural bases of its own existence. And this image of the Ouroboros is going to come back, so hold it in your mind. So none of that is really entirely new, as I'm sure many of you will already know. Immanuel Wallerstein and more recently Jason W. Moore have argued that since the colonization of the Americas in the long 16th century, the inauguration of the capitalist world system, the world's strong economic cores have repeatedly predated on and exhausted their colonial peripheries, treating these sites as frontiers of extraction, so in other words, as sites of cheap labor and resources. These regions have therefore long experienced the violent and corrosive effects of extraction and exploitation, which means that they have extended experience of the social and ecological crises currently proliferating on a global scale. And those are the crises to which Fraser drew attention in the first slide. So what is new then is actually the scale and the scope of unfolding catastrophe, which is no longer confined to formerly colonized regions across the global south. For Moore, in this book, Capitalism in the Web of Life, that you can see on the screen, the planetary reach of social and environmental breakdown represents the impending failure of capitalism as a system. That is the failure of its signal survival strategy, which is that process of identifying sources of work and energy that can be appropriated for free. And Moore describes that this failure as follows. He writes, "Today it is increasingly difficult, today being today in a moment of manifold crises, it is increasingly difficult to get nature, including human nature, to yield its free gifts on the cheap. This indicates that we may be experiencing not merely a transition from one phase of capitalism to another, as has historically happened, but something more epochal, the breakdown of the strategies and relations that have sustained capital accumulation over the past 5 centuries. Fraser's Ouroboros, you'll remember the snake that eats its own tail, it emblematizes this situation that Moore is describing. In the image of the snake with no more tail to devour, we can see the end of the road for capitalism. Capitalism is, in this image, a system with nowhere left to go but into its own center. What cannibal capitalism shows us then is that colonial history is not really history at all. Rather, the ecocide and destruction that mark the colonial project might more properly represent the future of the planet. This point has been made by a number of scholars. In his book, Planetary Mind, which you can see on the left of the screen, Martín Arboleda argues that in the age of planetary crises, which are met by intensifying efforts to reinstate capitalist extraction, the periphery, which was once a physical site, is now, in his words, a ubiquitous socio-spatial condition. The idea resonates with Jean and John Comaroff's earlier argument, which they make in their book called Theory from the South. They write that, contrary to the received Euro-modernist narrative of the past 2 centuries, which has the global South tracking behind the curve of universal history, always in deficit, always playing catch-up, there is good reason to think the opposite, that it is the South that is often the first to feel the effects of world historical forces, and so the South prefigures the future of the global North. Collectively, these authors, so the Comaroffs and Moore, Arboleda, collectively, these authors show us that the age of expanding and accelerating socio-ecological crises, the age of the Ouroboros with no more tail left to devour, is also the age of what Kojo Karam, drawing on Aimé Césaire, has recently called the colonial boomerang. So Karam writes as follows, and again, he's drawing on Aimé Césaire, who makes the argument for the colonial boomerang famously in Discourse on Colonialism. Colonial relations are subject to the boomerang effect, meaning that experiments carried out in the peripheries of empire eventually come flying back to its very heartland. So the argument here is something like, in the generalization of social and environmental precarity that we're seeing unfolding, in the penetration of these conditions of vulnerability into the hitherto relatively insulated global North, we should see evidence that colonial history is returning. The conditions of colonialism are returning and expanding and coming, as Karam says, to fly back into the very heartland of empire. Okay, so all of that is a bit of a preamble to what I'm actually going to talk about in this presentation, which is Gothic, and I'm going to say more about that in a moment. I'm going to be talking about two films, as I mentioned in the title. The one is Mati Diop's film Atlantique, which is translated as Atlantics in English, and the other is Remy Weekes's film His House. I'm going to be suggesting that in both of these films, Gothic, and again I'm going to describe what I mean by that in a moment, the Gothic forms provide a critical cultural language for vulnerability to the socio-ecological effects of capitalist extraction and exploitation in the age of planetary crisis. So this is the argument that I'm going to make. Both of these films deal with different aspects of migration from the African continent. So Mati Diop's film deals with Senegal, and His House deals with South Sudan. So these films look at aspects of migration from Senegal and South Sudan to parts of Europe, so respectively to an attempted crossing to Spain in the case of Atlantics, and a crossing to the United Kingdom in the case of His House. If we read these films together, and this is the kind of overarching argument of my talk, if we read these films together, what becomes clear is that Gothic as a language for vulnerability traces out something like the trajectory of a boomerang. So what we see by reading Gothic in these films, reading across these films for their Gothic forms, is the way in which the old core or metropolitan regions of the world are increasingly becoming subject to conditions which have long been experienced in the peripheral or colonial regions of the world. And that's kind of the presiding logic, and I will kind of cycle back to that thought towards the very end of the presentation. If you're interested in either of these analyses in particular, you can find them in the following publications. You can find the section on Atlantique in the Edinburgh Companion to Global Gothic, which is a collection that I have recently edited in my chapter, which is called Anthropocene Gothic, Capitalocene Gothic, and that includes an extended version of the analysis that I'm going to kind of give you a précis of in this talk. And then the analysis of His House you can find in forthcoming publication, a collection edited by Jeffrey Weinstock called A Cultural History of Monsters. It says a cultural history of monsters here, but it should be a cultural history of monsters. And then both of the talks are also relevant to another publication that I have coming, or for a forthcoming publication, the Cambridge Companion to World Gothic Literature, which I am editing with my colleague Rebecca Kumsty, where we make an argument that relates to this kind of boomerang trajectory of history. Okay, so if you're interested, that's where you can find out more. Okay, but let's say something about the Gothic. I'm not sure how much exposure the audience has to the notion of Gothic. Perhaps if you have an understanding of it, what you might think of is the sort of classical Gothic in its strictest sense. That's a kind of 18th century, usually British literature. And here you have two examples of early Gothic texts on the screen. The one is Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, and the other is Anne Radcliffe's Mystery of Udolpho. These are two early iterations of kind of classical Gothic, which demonstrates some of Gothic's kind of signal tropes. The first being a literature which is concerned with fear, anxiety, and terror, and then the other being a kind of an obsession with sort of pre-Enlightenment forms of knowledge and sort of pre-capitalist social relations. So the archaic, the magical, those sorts of things. So on the one hand, early Gothic, sort of Gothic in its classical sense, it's going to become clear why I keep saying in its classical sense. Gothic in its classical sense is identified with this particular moment in the British literary canon with narratives that on the one hand, are extremely interested in the pre-Enlightenment past, and which are characterized specifically by sensations of fear and anxiety on the other. So those are that's kind of traditionally what Gothic literature is. Now, what does that have to do with all of the all of my initial comments on the self-cannibalizing socio-ecological system of capitalism? Well, quite a lot, as it turns out. So the following quote from David Punter will begin to shed light on why that is. In the literature of terror, Punter points out that the period that saw the birth of the Gothic novel was that in which the early forces of industrialization were producing vast changes in the ways that people lived and worked. Rural patterns of life were being broken up by the enclosure of land and by the labor demands of urban-centered industry. The stability of an at least theoretically long accepted social structure was being dissolved amid the pressure of new types of work and new social roles. So what Punter is pointing out here is that Gothic appears, it first appears in Britain amid a vast restructuring of social and ecological relationships under an emerging form of capitalism. So these are huge changes that transformed land into property, into resources, and it transformed populations into workers, into the proletariat. These are the changes which Gothic appears in the midst of. And so it may seem reasonable to assume that the kind of anxiety that is encoded in the Gothic text has something to do with the bewildering experience of this vast socio-ecological transformation. And this is a point which has been made by Stephen Shapiro in his article, Transylvania, Dracula's World System and Gothic Periodicity. And Shapiro connects canonical Gothic forms, so the kind of narrative that you've just seen on the screen there, to forms of supernaturalism which attend the arrival of capitalist relations elsewhere in the world. So including in his article, East and West Africa, South Asia, and the Caribbean. Drawing on Michael Tausig's analysis of devil beliefs among proletarianized indigenous communities in South America, Shapiro explains his thought as follows. So he writes, and this is the first quote that you see on the screen: as laborers are wrenched from a peasant mode of production and projected into a capitalist mode of production, in which they control neither material labor nor its organization, the subjects crossing the threshold produce devil beliefs as a means of registering the process of proletarianization of the peasant. So understood with Shapiro, Gothic becomes, or Gothic might be interpreted as something like the European name for a much wider cultural phenomenon. And this is the argument that my colleague Rebecca Kumsty and I are making in our forthcoming collection on world Gothic literature. So Gothic might be understood as something like the European name for a much wider cultural phenomenon. Gothic could be seen to designate a kind of anxious supernatural response to a community's incorporation into a capitalist socio-ecology, or their reincorporation with a new wave of capitalization, as Shapiro makes clear in the second quote, where he writes, heightened supernaturalism emerges as a cultural marker of a region's initial appropriation by liberal political economy, that is capitalism, but it also appears with each new turn of the screw. Gothic is thus the modern mode for representing the reinstallation of capitalist relations. And so what this means is that in a very basic sense, Gothic forms can be understood as locally specific, but potentially globally expansive modes of mediating the experience of vulnerability to violent capitalist socio-ecological relationships. And that connection between Gothic and the experience of violence is important, because it means that as Gothic forms witness the disruption and transformation of a particular socio-ecology with the emergence of capitalism, they also possess a kind of proto-critical charge. So because they witness the violence of this process, they have the potential, in other words, to kind of expose the destructive, exploitative, extractive nature of the capitalist relation to which they are responding. And this is a point which has been made by the Warwick Research Collective in their analysis of critical irrealism, which is a term that they take from Michael Levy. The Warwick Research Collective note that in certain texts, that kind of proto-critical possibility that I've just mentioned in relation to the Gothic becomes a kind of consciously delivered strategy. In other words, the Gothic becomes a way of deliberately critiquing those relations of extraction and exploitation to which it responds. So they write of critical irrealism. I see that my PowerPoint has just shut down and it is reopening. Apologies, everyone. I'm not sure what happened there. Let me try. Let me see if I can get it back. Right. Okay, it is now open. Can I share it? So, okay. Right. I think it's coming. Here it is. There it is. Okay. Sorry about that. Now, where were we? Critical irrealism. So basically, the point is that critical irrealism critical irrealism is a mode of kind of supernatural narrative or discourse that not only registers or bears the imprint of a disrupted socio-ecological life world, but actually consciously critiques that life world as well. And as we will see in Atlantique and His House, Gothic in these films falls into that category of critical irrealism, right? These are narratives in which Gothic aesthetics are mobilized in the first instance to articulate experiences of vulnerability under capitalist conditions, right? So that is Shapiro's argument as well. But in these texts, there is also an effort to map out and interrogate the histories and relationships out of which those conditions emerge. So there is this conscious effort to kind of trace out the reason for the disruption. And as we'll see, if we read these texts together, we get this picture of a boomerang trajectory that I have been referring to so far. Okay, so Atlantique, by Mati Diop, is a kind of a combination of a love story and a ghost story. The film is set in Dakar, which is the capital of Senegal. And the protagonists are Ada, played by Mama Beneta Sane, who you can see on the center of the screen there, and Suleiman, played by Ibrahima Traore, who's right underneath there. Ada and Suleiman are in love at the beginning of the story, but they're unable to be together, basically because Suleiman is poor. He's a construction worker who works on a fictional skyscraper, which is going to become very important to the analysis in a moment. When the film opens, Suleiman hasn't been paid in 3 months. And increasingly desperate, he and his colleagues attempt to make the dangerous crossing to Europe in a small boat or a pirogue. That's something which is also going to become important. A storm strikes while they are en route, and tragically they drown. And the Gothic element of the film comes in thereafter, when the spirits of the drowned crew return to Dakar to possess the bodies of their loved ones. And then together, the the mourning lovers and the drowned crew kind of seek out revenge, which is enacted on the manager of the construction project that Suleiman is working on. But we can understand that revenge as being sort of wider in resonance and scope as well, as I think will become clear. So here, just so that we know, here on the screen at the top, we can see an image of the character Fanta, played by Aminata Kane. This is Fanta in this particular moment. Fanta is possessed by one of the spirits, and that's signaled by these blanked out eyes that the character has. And then I also want to kind of preface the analysis by saying that this is the film is dealing with a real situation. That migration from, small boat migration from Dakar to parts of Europe is a genuine issue and extremely dangerous. And again, this will come back as well in the talk. Okay, so I already mentioned that Suleiman works on a skyscraper. He works in construction, building this fictional tower. So this is not a real tower, but it dominates the Dakar skyline in the film. It is also, this tower is also central to the critical irrealist, or the critical part of the film's strategy. It is notably a kind of an avatar for post-colonial mega projects overall. So mega projects are these giant, often infrastructural developments. In this case, it's not infrastructural development, it's property development, but giant developments which have emerged across Africa and other post-colonies in the post-colonial period. They're financed by foreign capital, often entailing public-private partnerships. And then they also often regularly serve the purpose of linking Africa more tightly to global commodity chains and logistical corridors, as is certainly the case in Dakar's currently developing mega project, which is a deep water port facility that you can see here on the screen. And there is a potential sense in which the skyscraper kind of stands in for this port facility in the film. It's not clear, but I think you can make that connection. It's not explicit, but I think you can make that connection. This tower kind of dominates the skyline. It's as a kind of a representative of this kind of mega project. And this kind of mega project is also used in the film as shorthand for a particular model of development, which is something like the model of development implemented under neoliberal structural adjustment around the end of the 20th century. So structural adjustment policies or programs, as I'm sure many of you know, were packages of economic policies that were implemented by post-colonial governments in the aftermath of decolonization, basically in order to qualify for loans from institutions of international finance. And so the kinds of things that structural adjustment policies demanded of newly post-colonial states were as follows. And you can see here the quote from Lazarus on the screen. So the removal of all restriction on foreign investment, huge cuts in government provision, the slashing of wages, the privatization of state enterprises and social services. So these kinds of intensely neoliberalizing economic policies were kind of bundled up in these structural adjustment programs and imposed really on post-colonial states, including on Senegal. Because structural adjustment programs basically open the domestic economy of the post-colony to foreign control, and they and sort of transform the domestic economy of the post-colony into in the interests of international finance and multinational capital. They can be understood in the way that Neil Lazarus understands them here as a favored means of disciplining post-colonial states, domesticating them and rendering them subservient to the needs of the global market. That is kind of maintaining post-colonies in the position of colony. So making sure that that transition from colony to post-colony is not too radical, or not so radical that it would prevent access from the formerly colonial power to the resources and labor of the colony. Suleiman's experience on the tower kind of gives us a sense of what structural adjustment, of the kind of lived effects of structural adjustment from below, as it were. So as I mentioned earlier, he at the start of the film, he hasn't been paid in 3 months. And his manager basically his manager sort of refuses to listen to his requests for his salary. If we think about this in the context of the wider kind of ramifications of structural adjustment, we can also see how intense the desperation experienced by the character is, because in addition to slashing wages, or in this case having no wages, the structural adjustment programs also erode the safety net, meaning that there is kind of nothing to catch the character who is experiencing this real destitution. And this is really, this experience of extreme poverty and extreme precarity is really instrumental in driving Suleiman towards the sea, or making migration seem like a feasible option. The film also gestures to the conditions which kind of compel Suleiman into the precarious wage economy in the first place. And those are really conditions of environmental exhaustion. So the boat in which all of the characters leave Dakar and head off to Europe is called a pirogue. And the pirogue is the namesake of the pirogue phenomenon, which names this wider phenomenon of migration from Senegal to Europe. The pirogue is traditionally a small fishing vessel. It's used by coastal communities in West Africa. However, overfishing in this region means that that way of life has been destroyed. So with no means of subsistence, communities are then driven into the precarious wage economy, which is emblematized by the tower, and the pirogue ceases to be a fishing vessel and becomes a kind of migrant ferry. So the film uses this image, this symbol, to kind of invoke this history of environmental violence, which overlays and compounds that history, that simultaneous history of precarity in the labor market. The film is also subliminally registering other forms of environmental violence. So in her own analysis of Atlantique, Lindsay Turner argues that the sort of velvety, smoky quality to the film, which you might have been able to see in previous images, references the very poor air quality in the city. So Dakar's air is about 5 times as polluted as it should be to be safely breathable. And the pollution comes from fires and transport, but it also comes significantly from industrial construction projects, such as the one around which the action in the film takes place, this tower. And in this image that you can see here on the screen, we have a character basically receiving the spirit, so being in the process of being possessed by a ghost. And this process of possession is kind of represented as a process of asphyxiation. So you can see these characters laboring for breath. And as Turner writes of this particular character, his breath is labored. And the causes for this are, we learn, supernatural, but it seems impossible to separate his condition from the density of the air. It's also important just to point out in relation to this, in relation to the strand of the narrative that engages with environmental violence, that deleterious characteristics such as the toxifying atmosphere in Dakar shouldn't be understood as kind of incidental effects of industry, but they can actually be understood as part of the calculus of structural adjustment. So in this very famous quote which is given in Rob Nixon's Slow Violence, and which comes from Lawrence Summers, who's the ex-president of the World Bank. He kind of really clarifies this. So he says, I've always thought that countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted. Their air quality is probably vastly inefficiently low compared to Los Angeles. Just between you and me, wouldn't it be, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the least developed countries? So here we see this kind of conscious calculus, which informs both this quest for cheap labor and cheap resources, but also for disposable environments. Okay, so just to come back to the Gothic aspect of the film, the returning dead, these restless spirits, can be understood as mediating an experience of Dakar characterized by intense exploitation and extraction in the wake of neoliberalization and structural adjustment. The aspects emphasized by the film are extreme precarity in the labor market, the ecological exhaustion and the destruction of livelihoods as a result of commercial overfishing, and environmental toxification, especially atmospheric toxification, as a result of this intense industrialization. And finally, the film reminds us that none of this is really new. All the way through the text, there are these repeated and lingering shots of the Atlantic Ocean, which are legible in terms, I think, of the English, or particularly clearly legible in terms of the English title of the film, which is Atlantiques, which reminds us that the tragedy of Suleiman and the migrant crew is the latest in a much longer trajectory of Atlantic tragedies, which incorporates the trade in enslaved people, which took place between Africa and the New World at the beginning of the world system. And so we're called to remember then that Dakar is home to a door of no return through which enslaved people were transported. And the effect of this kind of subliminal referencing of Atlantic slavery is to link the present crises witnessed by the film not only to capitalism in its neoliberal phase, but also to much older relations of extraction and exploitation, which begin with the colonization of the Americas. Okay, now I realize that I'm running out of time a little bit, but I'm going to keep going through this next section, and hopefully I'll get some grace for the technical error in the middle there. Right, so in Atlantiques, as we've just seen, Gothic is a language for socio-ecological vulnerability at a post-colonial periphery of the world system. The film shows that this is caused by the successive subordination of this region to extraction and exploitation that endures out of the colonial period to produce unlivable conditions that propel people towards Europe and the sea in search of a better life. His House, Remy Weeks's film, deals with the other end of the migrant journey. The protagonists are Bol and Rial. You can see them here on the screen. Bol played by Sope Diriso and Rial played by Wunmi Musako. They arrive in the United Kingdom from war-torn South Sudan. They have crossed the channel in a small boat, and they have also been hit by a storm. Many of the crew drown in this tragic episode, including a child whose name is Nyagak, and who you can see here. She's played by Malaika Wakoli Abigaba. And that this child, we believe initially, is Bol and Rial's daughter. When they have gone through the asylum process, so when they have been released into Britain from the detainment facility in which asylum seekers are held, Bol and Rial arrive at their newly assigned state home, which you can see here on the screen. But they find that something has come with them, or is perhaps already there. And this thing, this creature, is identified by Rial as an apeth or night witch, and it lives in the walls of their new house, and it seems to have raised Nyagak from the dead. Most immediately, the apeth or night witch seems to refer to the violence of the channel crossing and the trauma of the war zone. So, for example, early on in the film, Bol can be found hauling a rope out of a crevice in the wall of the house. And when he pulls it out, it's kind of covered in seaweed, and it seems to come from the boat. And it is also attached to Nyagak's doll. In a similar episode, Rial opens a cupboard in the house and she sees Nyagak's face pressed against the tail bar, the tail bar of a car. So the scene from when they left their village in the kind of initial moment of migration. The supernatural torment seems to sort of speak then to a legacy of trauma, a legacy of violence, but also to a legacy of shame and guilt, because we learn that actually Nyagak is not Bol and Rial's child. She is a child who Bol seized from her mother in order to secure passage out of their village. And what this suggests, I think, in the film is the kind of extreme action to which people are driven in extreme conditions, and the consequences which are suffered as a result of those extreme actions, and those consequences kind of incarnated in this violent figure of the Apeth. However, it is also clear in the film that the Apeth is already there, or it has something to do with conditions that are already there when Bol and Rial arrive. So a lot is made of this house that they are given. For example, their caseworker, who's played by Matt Smith, who you can see over here, he comments when he's letting them into the building that, oh, they must have won the jackpot. And this comment really only underscores quite how terrible and unfit for habitation the house is. It's full of insects, the sound of buzzing flies is everywhere, light and energy are intermittent, the walls are damp and rotting. And significantly, the Apeth makes itself felt through these marks of degradation in the house. So here you can see this image of Nyagak, the undead Nyagak, and she's standing there with her hand on the light switch. And you can also see she's standing next to this this wall, which is kind of riven with rot and damp. And so in this particular scene kind of encapsulates really clearly how the Apeth seems to incarnate the actual conditions in which the house is when Bol and Rial arrive in it. And this is important because the issues with the house, the damp and the intermittent light and energy are actually really existing problems in British social housing. So there has recently been a government inquiry into damp and mold in social housing because of the fatal consequences, especially for children, of black mold, endemic black mold. There has also been a rise recently in fuel poverty in the United Kingdom. That is the inability to afford light and heat in one's home. And so the kind of monstrification of these issues, or the monstrification of damp and of intermittent energy, seems to suggest that the film is using the Gothic here to skewer a sense of vulnerability within the housing system. And so just very briefly, without going into too much detail here, the decline of British social housing is an effect, as Stuart Hodkinson argues in this essay, The New Urban Enclosures, of neoliberalization after the Thatcher regime, which began in 1979. So the neoliberalization of British public housing has entailed the sale of formerly social housing to private institutions, but it has also entailed the outsourcing of contracting and construction, caretaking services, cleaning and maintenance, that kind of thing. And so it is possible to kind of connect the deteriorating conditions, the increase of damp, for example, and the increase of fuel poverty to this neoliberalization of the housing system. Okay, so on the one hand, the film is using Gothic to skewer vulnerability within the housing system, but on the other hand, it's using Gothic to as a kind of an index of what is called the hostile environment. The hostile environment is a set of policies around migration to the UK inaugurated by the Home Office under Theresa May in 2012. These were policies that were designed to curb so-called illegal migration on the grounds that UK public services were under threat and were going to be increasingly overwhelmed by migrants. As Weber, Francis Weber notes in his essay on the creation of the UK's hostile environment, these policies have the avowed aim of making life impossible for migrants and refugees who do not have permission to live in the UK, and which removes such migrants' rights from housing, health, livelihood, and a decent standard of living. The connection to the hostile environment is very clear in his house, because Bol and Rial's experience of the asylum system is basically accurate. So it corresponds very closely to actually existing procedure. Crucial for the film is the fact that they are forbidden from moving from their house, and they're also subject to mandatory surveillance. And these two things come back in kind of horrifying form, just as the intermittent electricity and the damp come back in monstrous form, so surveillance and confinement come back in monstrous form. So Bol becomes increasingly afraid that Rial will leave the house. She's trying to escape the monstrous Apeth figure, and so he locks her in. And you can see in this shot, he's insisting that she stay in the house. And then and so this is a kind of a monstrous representation of confinement. And then surveillance is also monstrously represented, because often we see with the Apeth from inside the walls. So there is this sense in which the characters are being surveilled by the monster, looking through the cracks in the walls, as in this shot that you have here. Okay, surveillance comes back also in another significant moment, where Bol realizes he's being watched suspiciously by a neighbor, and he tries to say hello to her. He waves, and she just kind of continues to glare icily at him. And this scene summons the sense in which the hostile environment is a set of policies, but it has also fostered a wider culture of racism and nativism, as Weber puts it. So for Weber, the hostile environment has entrenched racialized viewpoints about migrants to the point where people of color resident for decades are exposed to suspicion. So this kind of generalized suspicion is an effect of the hostile environment. Okay, so we have these two things, and I'm going to leap quickly over the next section. So we have these two aspects of vulnerability in the text, which are being witnessed in Gothic forms. On the one hand, we have degraded and unsafe living conditions in state-provided housing. And then on the other, we have dehumanization and hostility within the asylum system. Okay. A very important scene in the text begins to show how the film sees these two things, neoliberalization of the housing system and the hostile environment, fit together. Right at the beginning of the film, we learn from Bol that he used to work in a bank. Later, when Bol goes to the housing office to ask his asylum caseworker if he can move, because the house is, well, he says the house is filled with vermin, but of course he's trying to escape the Apeth. The caseworker discloses that he too used to work in a bank before they, quote unquote, moved all the jobs abroad. In the background, we can hear a chorus of office workers saying that Bol's house is bigger than theirs. And this echoes a point that the caseworker himself has made earlier on when he shows the couple around the accommodation. This moment is very important because it highlights the caseworker's own experience of neoliberalization in Britain. The multinationalization of the British workplace, that is the relocation of jobs to cheaper locations in the global south, has been, along with the privatization of social housing, a key cost-cutting strategy since the Thatcher era. Importantly, we've already encountered the other side of this process of neoliberal outsourcing in Atlantique. In that film, it is precisely the effects of that process which drive Suleiman and the migrant crew towards the sea. In his house, in the scene in the office, it becomes clear that the caseworker, despite appearing friendly, in some sense holds Bol, the former bank clerk, responsible for the decline of his own status, while also resenting him for enjoying the privileges, that is a large single-occupant house, that are now beyond the caseworker's means. So the scenario exposes the ideological or political function of the hostile environment discourse. It makes clear how racist conceptions of the undeserving migrant are intended to manage the corrosive effects of intensifying neoliberalization on the British population by directing attention away from the system of capital that is producing ever more precarious and vulnerable conditions of life, and turning it instead towards those seeking refuge in the United Kingdom from regions made unlivable by the same neoliberal processes. Khurram summarizes the point succinctly. The United Kingdom government committed to adopting a policy of turning Britain into a hostile environment for those deemed unwelcome in this country. Migrants were framed as intruders who were at fault for the austerity real British people were enduring, with no reflection on how the same financial speculation might have disrupted lives and pushed people across the world in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to cut all the way to the end here and just conclude by saying that reading comparatively across the Gothic forms in these two films makes visible the boomerang trajectory of colonial history to which Khurram has drawn attention. That is the sense in which northern states, hitherto relatively protected from the effects of their own geopolitical strategies, no longer occupy that insulated position. Intensifying extraction in the world's peripheries continues to render socio-ecological crises extreme in those regions. They become unlivable, as in Atlantique, prompting movements to the old economic cause of the global north. This, as Khurram notes, is itself a boomerang. It is the aftershock of neo-colonial exploitation. However, as his house makes especially clear in the present, not even the former metropole is insulated. At a moment when the Ouroboros has nearly consumed itself entirely, there is nowhere else left for capital to go but into its own heartland, meaning that conditions of vulnerability long experienced across the peripheries of the world system are now coming home like a boomerang to the core. And that is that.
That was great. Thank you so much, Dr. Duncan. It was wonderful, especially. No, that's fine. That's completely fine. And what was especially interesting was the boomerang metaphor to explain, to suggest the various forms of exploitation. I'm sure the audience will have a lot of questions. The floor is now open to questions, comments. Roy has a question. Please unmute yourself and go on, Roy, please.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan, for the presentation. I was wondering if we could say that the experiences of the women in both these films were doubly Gothic in the hostile environment, because, taking the case of Atlantique, Fanta is possessed by a spirit, and her, it is believed that she was possessed by the spirit because of her dressing style. If she had dressed quote unquote properly, the spirit would not have possessed her. This is of course not true, because the spirit even possesses the young detective, who seems quote unquote properly dressed all the time. And when we come to the second film, His House, we see that the caseworker addresses Ball as the person in charge when they are taken to the house, just because Ball is a man, and because Ball seems to pretend to behave like an English person instead of Rial, who embraces her own culture and still continues to speak in her own language. And Rial is trapped inside the house because you mentioned that the law restricts them from leaving, right? So Rial is trapped inside the house with both the apathy as well as the patriarchy. Ball's influence as well as the supernatural influence. So I was wondering if we could say the experience in moving from periphery to the metropole could be doubly Gothic for women.
Yes, I think that's a really good observation. Interestingly, so in the even longer version of my reading of Atlantique, I actually have there's an entire section on gender, which I perhaps should have also attempted to include. I think that initially, I think it's interesting your point about the sort of double oppression of the women who sort of, as I'm hearing you say, they sort of become vessels for the spirits of the men who go off in the boat. And that was something that I kind of initially thought when I saw the film. I was kind of asking these questions about. I asked this question of where does this leave where does this leave the women if they're just sort of vehicles for male revenge? But actually, on thinking more carefully about it, I think that's really not what's happening, because there is a whole narrative trajectory in the film which has got to do with marriage, which I sort of very briefly touched on, and basically, Ada and Suleiman can't get married because Suleiman is poor. And Ada is engaged to the a wealthy businessman, and her family are very happy about it, but she doesn't want to marry him. And what this situation is kind of foregrounding is the restrictive nature or the restricted choices available to women under these conditions of extreme neoliberalization, which are producing wage precarity, labor precarity. So basically, Ada cannot marry for love. She cannot be with the person that she loves because in order for that to happen, he would need to be wealthy, and he cannot be wealthy because of the situation. And so I make a much wider argument about social reproduction and kind of colonial institution of marriage using Maria Mies in the essay. But basically, I think as a result of this narrative strategy in Atlantics anyway, the possession by the women of the male spirits or of the men's spirits is kind of a moment of solidarity. They all go together. So they all go together ultimately at the end of the film and insist that the construction manager pays them what they are owed. And so in that film, I think that there is a kind of a pushing back against the gendered inflection or the gendered ramifications of these socio-economic and ecological shifts. And I mean, I'm not to go on too much more, but I think, I mean, you're right as well. There is definitely a gender aspect in his house. I mean, it's his house, and Rial is literally locked in. Bol tries to lock Rial in the house, which is this kind of canonical Gothic scene. But then it is also at the end of the film Rial who kills the Apeth. So it's ultimately Rial who has the sort of agency in the situation. So there is also, I think, a kind of pushing back there. I hope that responds to, or that kind of touches on some of the things that you said.
Yes, Dr. Duncan.
Dr. Duncan, there are a couple of questions in the chat box. I will read them out if you wouldn't mind. Shaintan has a couple of questions. The first one is, I am interested in the broad idea of what you called, quote, Gothic as a language of or for vulnerability, unquote, especially the way it gives a language to express the vulnerability as well as critiques it in the, quote, critical irrealist mode, unquote. I have always found monsters to be vulnerable beings. So can you touch upon the vulnerability of the monstrous/monstrosity in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really good observation. So yes, what I'm kind of doing in this with this presentation, what I've been doing is kind of suggesting that these supernatural figures, let me phrase it in a different way. It's sort of suggesting that these conditions of radical vulnerability, radical social and ecological vulnerability that are kind of explored in different ways across these films, that they kind of demand a supernatural language. So this is the irrealism argument. This is sort of Shapiro's argument that I was touching on. I mean, I don't want to misconstrue him, but this is how I'm reading him anyway. That radical precarity or radical vulnerability sort of demands an extreme language, and that kind of goes beyond what is presumed to be ordinary, presumed to be the ordinary from a particular perspective, and that Gothic functions in this way. Gothic can function in this way as a language for articulating this really extreme experience. And I think your point about monstrosity is interesting because definitely in his house, it is not the monster that is vulnerable. However, of course, there are examples, many examples of contemporary Gothic fiction, which do precisely try to sort of humanize monstrous figures, don't they? So I mean, I mean, I don't want to. Whenever somebody raises this point, you sort of always end up talking about something like Twilight. But you know, something like Twilight, which tries to kind of really humanize vampires and give them emotional processes and make them relatable, that kind of thing, is an example of yeah, the monster being sort of de-othered or made less terrifying. However, that's not the case in his house at all. The monster is a monster. It's a monster. And I think that the monster is a monster in that film because it is giving shape to a much more diffuse set of precarious, corrosive experiences. So the monster is kind of making concrete all of the horrible things that are going on, you know, with the house. It's falling down. It's kind of a toxic environment, with the hostile environment, with the attitudes of people who Bol and Rial meet on the street. I think the monster is kind of giving that those processes a sort of tangible, concrete form. So yeah, thank you for that. Really good question.
He has another one. What, or rather, how can the Gothic contribute in generating solidarity against such vulnerabilities or promote positive stories? I have experienced in my readings of Gothic studies that it can be a potent framework for critiquing the structural exploitations, but somehow is limited in terms of mobilizing solidarity/organization. In short, can Gothic be positive? I can only think of Catherine Spooner's idea of happy Gothic. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is interesting. That is a very good question. So I would actually maybe go out on a limb and say it can, and the reason has to do with the question, with the points that I've just made about Gothic providing a language for a certain kind of experience. So I think that, and I'm just trying to, how can we make this point, which is not, in a way, which is not the mouse nest, which is inside my head. So I think basically by articulating states of vulnerability, by sort of making them clear, giving them shape, it becomes possible to identify, I guess, resonances between different positions. So I have actually just written an entirely different article, which is not only about Gothic, but it does deal with Lingmar's novel Severance, which is about a zombie plague. And in that novel, in that analysis, I actually do say that the novel is, I do argue that the novel is trying to ask for, or is pointing towards the need for solidarity between different positions, between different regional positions, between different class positions, different positions of oppression. And my argument there is that the novel uses the figure of the zombie to kind of make visible this, in the way you have actually just said, to make visible the system and the structure that is doing the oppressing, so that it becomes possible to kind of join up the dots between these different states of vulnerability. I don't know, though, and this is perhaps actually your question, whether the Gothic actually does that thing itself. It might do, but perhaps right now, maybe the best it can do is to sort of, you know, be a bit of a litmus test and provide a way of making the system visible. I hope that addresses some of the points.
Thank you for that. I think Saurav had a question. Saurav, go on.
Hello, Dr. Duncan. That was a really nice lecture. I really enjoyed, I really found it interesting how you placed the Gothic alongside the economic idea. I mean, how you placed the idea of Gothic alongside the changing of a classical old economical system to a new capitalist one. So this is more of a comment, and I was thinking, what will be your take on this? So do you think then in the capitalist system as such, and we have been seeing this, the case of the SPAs, as you, SPS or SDS, I think, if I'm not saying it wrong, that you have pointed out. It has been a recurrent occurrence in many third world countries, right? I mean, we know how many mega projects China has, for example, in African countries, for instance. So do you think then the capitalist system of production necessarily needs to use Gothic as a framework for its own benevolence? Because what I was thinking, that when you talk about Gothic vulnerabilities as such, is it the vulnerabilities that are rendered Gothic, or the vulnerabilities are rendered because of a system that makes the workers, fear, or like, as you said, you took up the case of the Antique, for at Atlantique, for example, right, where Suleiman is seeing the system that he's a part of, right, and he can understand where it is going, but he can't do anything. So how would you see these two systems of working?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good question, which I've never thought of before. So thank you for that. The way that I understand it really is that. Well, I think that Shapiro gives actually a good. He gives a good analysis of how capital, like the arrival of a set of capitalist socio-ecological relations radically transforms the pre-existing life world, and that pre-existing life world may exist under a different set of capitalist socio-ecological relations. Maybe this is actually where what you're getting at. So if we just create a kind of imaginary narrative. So the idea is that the very first arrival of capitalism, the supernatural forms that emerge in that moment will have some strong relationship to the pre-existing cosmology. So you can think here, for example, and this is an argument that has been made, of the early figures of the zombie, which emerge on the plantations with enslaved people in colonial Haiti. So their zombie beliefs kind of appear as a way of giving shape to, or mediating, explaining the extreme violence of the plantation system. And they have their origins in African cosmologies brought across the Atlantic with enslaved people. However, so Shapiro says that as things go on and you get one system of capital layered on top of another system, people become separated from the oral or the folk traditions that would have initially supplied that very first Gothic moment, which would not be called Gothic, by the way, by most people. And so in the case of the 18th century, for example, when industrialization happens, Shapiro is basically, as I read him, I don't want to misconstrue him, but I think what he's saying is that those populations in 18th century Britain, they're very far separated already from folk traditions, and so they reach back to more modern seeming analogues for kind of folk and oral tradition. And so that's why you get like the devilish aristocrat, for example. The kind of Catholicism is something which comes up often in early Gothic fiction. And then these tropes get recycled as time goes on. So there is, I think what you're saying, there is a pre-existing language now. I mean, there is a pre-existing language of Gothic which can just be reached back and used again. So it's not necessarily a new discourse that is produced every time there is a crisis or every time the capitalist system reorganizes itself. The discourse that people reach for, or that writers reach for, or people reach for, is one which has been pre-made in the previous system. Am I making any sense? I hope I am. I feel like I'm going very abstract.
No, this is actually it was interesting because it actually works in a certain way, because the fear of the unknown is also something that rests in a culture that they're coming from, right? I mean, I think in recently we saw a film called Deepan, for example. I mean, though it was not of the same topic, but I think I remember seeing a film called Under the Shadow.
Oh, yeah.
It was on Netflix, yeah. So the use of the ghost, the child ghost, as something that the mother is feared in the entire film, and then in the end, how it transforms into a political fact that they show through the misheaded. So it's something interesting that how in, maybe to put it simply, in the times of our direst crisis, we turn back to the cultures we know best, and how that forms our way of reacting to the situation we find ourselves in. So thank you, man. That's a good way to think about it.
Thank you for the question. It's really good question.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan. If there are no more questions, we could probably conclude today's talk with a formal vote of thanks by Shayantan Lahiri, who is an alumnus of the department. Over to you, Shayantan.
Thank you, Atul. Am I audible? Just to check.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Yeah. So, on behalf of the Department of English and UNESCO Chair at the Department of English, I would like to thank Dr. Rebecca Duncan for the wonderful talk. In the talk, she focused upon the how Gothic can be a language for expressing and as well as critiquing the notions of vulnerability. In the sense of we encountered the ideas of degraded housing conditions, dehumanization, hostility, and hostile nature, and the critical realism ideas in the discussion of the Gothic. So thank you, Dr. Rebecca. I think your lecture will encourage us to think more deeply along the lines of the intersections of Gothic studies and vulnerability studies. We thank Professor Pramod Nair and Professor Anna Kurian, and also all the audience who were present today to listen to the talk. So thank you, everyone. Over to Atul.
So thank you once again, Dr. Duncan. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was fun.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.